Well, welcome back to the Classic Working Vehicles channel. This is probably a fairly short video, but what I wanted to show you was what the process was for tipping the cab on a 421. But it's the same principle on a 406 and a 416. It doesn't matter whether it's the closed cab or the open cab, i.e. the soft top like we've got here, they all use the same principle. And they're all capable of tipping the cab, but it's not like on a modern truck where it's just a case of undoing a latch and hydraulically pumping it up. There's a little bit of work to do first. So I wanted to show you through that because I thought it might be useful for other owners. The reason I need to tip the cab is because it's in for a clutch change, so the engine needs to be removed. So on Unimogs of this era, the cabs are 3-point mounted. There's 2 mounts at the rear of the cab and 1 centrally at the front. Went through a couple of different designs. This is the earlier design. The later front mount bolts through vertically, but they both do the same job. They allow the cab to move independently of the chassis if the chassis is twisting off-road. This is great, but it means there are no tipping hinges for the cab. On a modern truck, usually it might be a suspended cab, but it will have hinges it can tip on. This doesn't have that. Now people do try and tip on this central bush here. I wouldn't recommend that. It becomes incredibly unstable and would all get a bit hair-raising. So there was a couple of designs over the years of tipping hinges that you could attach to kind of add some temporary hinges to the cab to be able to tip it up. If you look at the later square cabs, they have a fold-down hinge that allows you to put those in place to tilt the cab for maintenance purposes. So these are the hinge clamps, and these will work with the 421, the 406, the 416, any of the round cab generation Unimogs. I actually found these on eBay from an Argentinian seller because Argentina had, well, they built Unimogs under license, in fact. So I don't think these were ever used. These were brand new when they arrived with me. So they were a good find. And I actually used them quite a bit. There's slightly different bolt hole positions depending on whether you're tilting a 406 cab or a 421. So I've marked where the bolt holes are, just so I'm not mucking about every time I use them. It just makes it easier. As I'm getting older, my failing memory helps me remember where things should go. So it's not strictly necessary, but what I'm going to do, since this one has a hydraulic rear bed, is tip that up, just so I've got some better access as I'm working on the vehicle. And then we'll start to look at what we need to do to the cab to prepare it for being tipped. So there's a few things that need disconnecting between the engine and things that are mounted on the cab. One of the things is the air cleaner hose, or the air intake hose, but also the engine oil breather. So under the cab, really, that's all you need to disconnect. However, what I've discovered over the years is these vehicles have often been modified, things have been added to, changed, so on. So it's always worth having a really good look around to see if there's anything else connected in ways you're not expecting. And something I've just spotted on here is that there's some sort of hydraulic valve here, and that to be able to mount it has been bolted to the air compressor. The trouble is that's attached to the cab, this is attached to the chassis. So we're going to need to disconnect this here, otherwise we're going to have a problem when we come to tilt the cab. So always have a look around, check if there's anything else, and when we start to tip it, I'll have a further look around gradually as we're tipping it to see if there's anything else that is getting strained or anything else that's been connected in a way that I'm not expecting. So we need to be able to disconnect the steering column from the steering box. To be able to do that, we're going to do this boot down here, and then the universal joint that's on the end of the steering column. We take out the bolt nearest the steering box to do that. So this is the universal joint we're looking at here at the end of the steering column. It's a bit hard to film, but what I need to do is undo that bolt that I'm pointing at there, and then the steering column itself, again, should slide up so I can get it off the end of the spline shaft. So the steering column is now clear of the steering box. So there's 4 swing over sort of clamps that hold the gear change boot in place. So they need moving out of the way. The whole set of gear levers and the boot that cover them, all of them stay with the transmission when you tilt the cab. We loosen these off, and we should be able to just turn these keys inwards like that. There's 4 of them. So there's a nut on either side of this bush that mounts the cab. They don't need to come all the way off because the mount is slotted, but they need to be loosened. So we can start to put these clamps in place. So I put a thin sheet of rubber between the clamp and this cross member just to try and protect the paint a little bit. So we're trying to line up the clamp with this hole in the chassis here, and there's a threaded hole in the bottom of this part of the clamp which will go into there, but we actually need to lift the front of the cab before that will slide in. On the driver's side of the cab, it's slightly different because of this kind of arch shape that goes over the front PTO output in the frame, and you can't centrally mount this frame, the clamp won't go on, so you need a longer bolt to go through to offset it. So I won't clamp that down fully until I know I've got things properly aligned. So my technique is just to sit on the lever to get a bit of pressure on it while I put the pin in. So I've just gone to take the bolts out of these cab mounts, and they're actually missing, they're not in there. So there's nothing holding down the back of the cab at the moment. At the back of the cab there's a lifting loop which we can put a strop round and lift up the back of the cab with, very gently to begin with. So I'm lucky enough in my workshop that I've got an overhead crane that I can use for jobs like this. The handbook actually says in an emergency 4 people, 2 on each side, can lift the cab. Personally, I wouldn't like to try that, not least because it needs propping up to be safe. There's nothing to stop it falling back down again, and it wouldn't give you much control. You could do this with an engine hoist coming in from the side, would be another way of doing this. The trouble is the point of lift moves forward as you elevate the cab. So if you bring an engine hoist in from the side, it's going to try and tip it over. So really something like an overhead crane, or if you're on a farm, a telehandler, something like that would be useful to lift the cab. I find this ideal though because it's very controllable. It's even better than an electric hoist in my opinion. Electric hoist is useful if you're doing a lot of lifting, but if you want precision, hand operated chain hoist like this, I still think is the best thing. So all I'm going to do to begin with is just take up the tension, take off the load off the back of the cab, and just see if those rear mounts are going to come away cleanly. So one side's popped off, and the other side's popped off. So I think we're away. I'm going to before I go too far, I'm going to have a look around, just check that everything looks okay. At the moment, everything looks all right, so I'll carry on. So things like the handbrake can get snarled up. It needs to be applied, otherwise it gets caught on the surround around the gear change boot. So an additional hydraulic line had been put in here, and I think it was going to get stretched. So I've just disconnected that and capped the ends of it. So that's why it's worth taking your time. So I think we're there. Well, that's it. That's the cab tilted. I've put in my homemade prop just to secure it and make it safe. I've fabricated this with an angle in it just because it gives me easier access to the engine when I'm working on it, rather than having a bar here, which tends to get in the way. I've also left the chain hoist on the back of the cab for the time being, just as an extra bit of security. If you're wondering why the Unimog's up on blocks on the front axle, I need to be able to get my engine crane in to lift the engine up and forwards to do the clutch change, and I'm a bit limited on clearance, so that helps me get the elevation that I need on the crane. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope it's been interesting, and I'll see you next time.
Oh, and finally, as all good manuals state, reassembly is the reversal of removal.